was particularly taken by Paul when he was introduced at a leadership meeting in February in New Orleans, a month after he was named to head the whole thing. And there were 5 or 6 of us there, and he gave a speech that just was right between the eyes, right on the importance of the Charter and what our core values are, and to be more activist. So I went up to him after that speech, cornered him, and signed him up to be with us tonight. And I'm delighted that we have him for the evening and for so much time. Please give a warm welcome to Paul H. Smith, CFA, CEO, President.
Thank you, Phil. I guess, see if I can work the technology apart from anything else. Gosh, yes. Well, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for that very generous introduction, Ursula. Thank you for your hospitality tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's never difficult to come to Florida in the wintertime, so whenever you want me here, I promise you I'll come back when it's cold elsewhere. As Phil said, I live in Hong Kong. In fact, I've been there 20 years now. And I suppose that's really, you know, as you can hear, I'm English, as Phil said. Lived in Asia for 20 years. Worked in the States for 3 at various times in my career in New York. Although I'm fully conscious that most people wouldn't consider New York to be part of the United States. But anyway, that's another story. And France for 4 years. So I've sort of, in Paris, so I sort of traveled around a huge amount, been very lucky in my career, and I think that's really why the Institute asked me to do this. I'm very proud to say I'm the first non-American to have this role, and the first person who does not live in Charlottesville to have this role, or does not live in the US to have this role. So it's something of a challenge. I spend 40% of my time in the Americas region, so that's Canada all the way down to Chile. Obviously, we have a lot of societies, and I'll come back to that in Latin America, which is very exciting. 40% of my time in Asia, and 20% of my time in Europe. And that division of labor, if you like, is reflective of our spread of activity. Still to this day, 60-odd% of our members are here in North America, but 50% of our candidates are in Asia. So that really explains that split. And neither one nor the other are in Europe. So I spend 20% of the time time back there. So that's really the background to that. Delighted to be here also on Charter Award Night, and you know, building the investment profession. I always like to depress all the new young charter holders by saying that tonight is the beginning and not the end of your professional career. And obviously entering a profession like ours, that's a commitment to lifelong learning. That's another depressing phrase, basically. But one of the points that I would make as we go through, you know, building a profession, is I always like to torture doctors in terms of trying to use analogies to sort of talk about what a profession is and what building professionalism is. And you know, I'm well into my 50s, and if you went to a doctor who qualified when they were 30 and they hadn't read a textbook until you know, then you were seeing them as a 56-year-old, as I am, you'd be absolutely horrified. You know, you expect your professionals, whether it's mandatory or not is irrelevant, you expect your professional to commit themselves to lifelong learning. And if we don't have that, really, we have absolutely no right to call ourselves a professional. Our industry, as we all know, moves very, very fast, and we need to be, if we're to serve our clients properly, at the top of our game at all times. Like all good presentations, I'm going to start in the middle. And start with our mission statement, which I'm sure you have all committed to memory, and I won't ask you to recite it for me. But basically, the reason I like to start with this is because a couple of things to say. I am not changing the logo. I'm not changing the mission. I'm not changing the name of the institute. I'm not changing our relationship to our societies. And I'm certainly not changing the value of the charter in terms of diluting the standard that you've all worked so hard to achieve. What I am trying to do is to take the mission that was developed 5 or 6 years ago and try to explain it or interpret it a little bit more than I think has been done in the past. I've worked in the Institute for sort of 2.5 years before I became CEO. And so I hit the ground pretty much running, knowing what I wanted to do and knowing what my diagnosis, if you like, of the issues were. And the main thing that I think I brought to the Institute was just one word, really, which was focus. I think over the last 7 or 8 years, we've lost our focus a little bit as an institute. And this mission statement, in some ways, sort of underlines that lack of focus. Firstly, what is the investment profession? It's actually not a very helpful phrase. And one of the things I've been trying to do in terms of focus is to say the way that I wish to interpret that, the investment profession, and this is quite controversial, a lot of people who don't agree with this, is to interpret that as the investment management profession. People who are fiduciaries for other people's money. That includes obviously everybody from private wealth all the way through to sovereign wealth funds and everything in between. But what we are in business to do, and it's very important from my perspective, because we need to focus what the Institute produces. You need to focus what you produce as a society as well. And the curriculum needs to focus on what it is trying to teach. And actually, when you look at all of that, what we're really trying to be expert in as a group is the investment management profession. That is not to say that we exclude anyone from our family. Anyone who is interested in investment management, whether those are lawyers, met a lawyer today who's a CFA, accountants, lots and lots of accountants around the world who are CFAs, or any other profession who wants to come and study the CFA and be part of our communities, we welcome with open arms. A lot of our membership is somewhat confused by that. They feel that focusing on the investment management industry is a bit exclusionary. It's sort of excluding people. It's not meant to be. It's kind of the best way I can describe it is I'm not a religious person, but if I were and I was a pastor in a church, if you don't have a belief, then why would you expect your congregation to turn up on a Sunday? And that's really what I'm trying to do with the focus on the investment management industry, is to say that's where we're expert, that's where we want to go deep, that's what we want to provide in terms of services, really in-depth understanding of the investment management world. And anyone, whatever their walk of life is, who's interested in the investment management world is very welcome to come and join us. And so that's the sort of mission. The other aspects there, the phrase that isn't there, which is the other piece of focus I've tried to bring, is if you look at that mission statement, there's no mention of members. And I find that quite odd, really, because when I look at the Institute, I say, well, what are we? We are a membership organization that's committed to building the investment management profession. What we are not, which a lot of people think we are, is an educational organization that has members stuck on the side, basically. And when you go back into the history of the CFA, how it was all put together, and when you, and often within my own colleagues in Charlottesville, we are very academically inclined at times, and we tend to behave or be a little bit more comfortable being an academic organization that has rather irritating members. And what I'm trying to do is to turn that on its head and say, first, second, and last, we are a membership organization that is dedicated to leading the investment profession for the ultimate benefit of society. And so how do we do that if we don't focus relentlessly on what you all need and on supporting you in your communities? Because it is through impacting the communities that we serve, and we now have 146 societies around the world, Chile was the last one in September. The 147th I'm going to in 2 weeks' time in Bangladesh, which is very exciting. We open up in Dakar in 2 weeks. I've never been to Bangladesh, so very excited about that. We have 147 societies, so 147 communities around the world in well over 80 countries around the world, where we are trying, through our members, to influence the way that the investment profession works and runs. So that's really my take on that, and I'll come back to some of the tactics. And then finally, this idea about investment profession. Do we have a profession? And I guess what I want to do within the Institute, and certainly within the membership, is to challenge us all to think a little bit more about what a profession is and whether we do have a profession, in the same sense that lawyers can say that they have a profession, actuaries can say that they have a profession, accountants can say that they have a profession. Do we truly have a profession? And I guess my answer to that is no, we don't. We have 130,000 people who may be acting professionally, but they're serving an industry, essentially, rather than serving a profession in the true sense of that term. Because when you think about what a profession has, the one distinguishing characteristic that a profession has is that society says it's a profession. You don't get to self-declare professionalism. Society tells you whether you're a profession or not, and the way that it does that is by building a legal fence around you and preventing other people who do not have the correct credentialing to enter into that profession and to practice as an investment management professional. And as we all know, when you go around the world, most countries, most states, most jurisdictions do not invest us with that degree of trust, effectively. So when I look at this mission, I really say, well, leading the investment profession is fine, but I think we've got to build it first. And so really that's the subject of my presentation tonight, is how do we really focus, how do we challenge ourselves to build a profession the right way and to lead that profession through active, well-educated, ethical members. That's got your half a CE credit just there, Phil. I mentioned ethics. Phil made me promise I would do that, so you could tick that box. How do we do that collectively together? So that's really what I'd like to accomplish tonight. So just flicking back to the beginning again. So the backdrop to the industry at the moment is pretty positive, and it's perhaps easier in some ways to see that from my vantage point based out in Asia than it is sometimes in the developed world where things aren't perhaps as vibrant. But the middle class is growing, almost doubling over the next 20 or 30 years, primarily obviously in Latin America and Africa, in Asia. And assets are set to compound over the next few years by about 6% per annum towards $100 trillion US dollars from about 75 to 80 trillion US dollars today. So peculiarly, investment management has never been a more required discipline than it is today. Assets are continuing to rise. The number of middle-class clients that are out there are continuing to grow. So the backdrop to the whole industry is very positive. And you look at revenues per employee and margin, our business is still wonderfully profitable. The DJIA, I think the net profit margin on the DJIA is about 9%. The quoted asset management companies have a percent of about 33, I think, their net margin. So it's a wonderfully profitable business. And asset management is also quite lucrative on an individual basis. On average, we're paid about $157,000 a year. Before the financial crisis, investment bankers were paid just over 2.2 times that number. Today, the average investment banker gets about $163,000 US dollars a year. So the gap between investment banking and investment management has shrunk hugely since the financial crisis. And we've maintained our earnings, and our businesses have also maintained their margins in the main. This, I was chatting to Phil earlier on about the alternative industry. I like this slide. I mean, basically it shows that 101 trillion US dollars, And passive investments will still be a relatively small part, but I'll come back to that. But alternatives there, that 13% of assets that are run in alternatives, apparently by 2020 will account for 40% of all net profits in the asset management world. 40%. So I leave that with you as a thought. As an industry, are we selling the products our clients need, or are we selling the products that make us most money? And I guess that's again, it's a distinction between what I would call a profession and an industry. Is a profession sells a service to people, it doesn't sell a product. And I think the way that we're structured today is very much as a product selling business as opposed to a service selling business, which is more the characteristic that one would expect from a profession. So it troubles me that 40% of our profits in a few years' time will come from a mere 13% of the assets under management. I think that's going to be a challenge for our industry and a challenge for our reputation as we go forward. 30% now in America, I think it's almost 35% in America, of all of our members are now in private wealth management of one sort or another. That is a huge shift. We believe that that is going to continue over the next few years, that more and more of our charter holders will be in the private wealth management space. I think that's a feature of the continued industrialization, if I can put it that way, of mainstream asset management, that the jobs really are being generated in private wealth management. This slide really just shows the way that those assets are baked at the moment, and the fact that Asia now is an extremely important part of the world's private wealth management industry. For those of us who live in Asia, that's a slightly delusional figure, if I can put it that way, in that those assets are not easy to come by. Most assets in Asia are still first generation owned, they're still tied up in businesses, and they're not predisposed towards buying financial services products. But in essence, Asia now is as wealthy in aggregate as the US. Passive investment, I think, is interesting. I know not everybody is in favor of passive investment. A lot of people are concerned about passive investment. I actually think, in some ways, it's a very positive thing as we develop as a profession. In that what passive investment does, through low-cost alternatives, through better transparency into fees, is it makes us think a little bit more about the value that we're adding to our clients. And I think that's really something that at the Institute we intend through our thought leadership work to really focus a lot more on, is how do we prove to society the value that we bring to society through our skills as solution providers, as risk managers, as asset managers for our clients. So passive investment, I know it's troubling in that it eats away at profit margins to some extent, but I think it is forcing us as professionals to think a little bit more clearly about how we charge our clients, how we have charged our clients in the past, and how do we prove out that value that we are offering. Robo-advice, I think, similarly, another technological innovation that also I think helps transparency, helps our clients see what we really do, and makes us think a little bit more carefully about the value that we bring to our clients. Someone made me laugh the other day. They said, as stock analysts, we spend all of our time congratulating other industries for technological innovation, but when it happens to us, we're not so pleased, basically. And I think that's, there's more than an element of truth behind that. Technology is disrupting our profession. It is reducing our margins. It is making it a lot more difficult to charge clients through products. And I think all of that ultimately is very healthy for us. If we are to build a sustainable business going forward, a sustainable profession going forward, then we have to be a lot more transparent and we have to provide a lot more value for money. And I think all of that is going to present a number of us with a great deal of challenge as we go forward. The flip side, obviously, of a lot of the problems that we've encountered over the last 7 or 8 years is increasing regulation. I'm sorry to have to say that I don't see any end to this. I think the cycle on regulation is very negative, and I think will continue to be negative for certainly the rest of my working life. I don't see that there's any end to it. I know to some extent, particularly at the big end of town, a lot of the asset management houses, I think, have their heads in the sand a little bit about regulation, things like the fiduciary rule, for instance, hoping that these things are going to go away. I don't think they are, for the simple reason that regulators are politicians, and they listen to what people think, and they respond to that. And I think at the moment, our profession, as we know, has its challenges in terms of its public perception. And the flip side of that is increased regulation, and I think that's here to stay, and not just in the US. Obviously, in Europe, it's an absolutely a tidal wave of regulation in Europe, and Asia to a certain extent as well. So I think we're going to suffer from technological disruption as well as increasing regulation. I'm sure you're all seeing that in your business: cost rising, margins falling. So again, what can the Institute do to help in that framework? Really, I think through a lot more carefully about how, as an industry, we present our value proposition to clients. Going back to doctors, I think it's quite instructive, because I think we have challenges on value proposition. You know, if you go to see a doctor, that doctor will either kill you or cure you in 3 months. So you kind of know whether a doctor is a good one or not. It's a lot harder when you go to your wealth advisor, because it could be years before you know whether your investment advisor has been a good one or a bad one. And so I think we do have this trouble to really sort of explain to the public what it is that we do and the value that we give. And so my analysis of that is that's why you see a lot of individuals who effectively self-medicate in the financial world. That they wouldn't think about that as far as their health is concerned, but as far as their wealth is concerned, because they don't see our value proposition as clearly as they should. They're much more inclined to do it through robo-advice or do it through some other low-cost solution rather than come to people such as ourselves. So I think lots of challenges there. The other thing that I like to point out is that if we want to change the outputs, if we want to change the outcomes, we need to change the inputs. And our gender balance, our diversity in general as an industry is absolutely woeful. And this is something that the Institute now is really focusing on, is how do we change the number of women candidates coming into the CFA program, and also how do we change the percentage of charter holder members in the program. It is a shock to me as a non-American that our lowest rates of female participation are here in the States. And remember that Asian number, 24%, includes India, where we have only 4% charter holders, and Japan, where we have only 4% charter holders. So it's the big diversifier there for Asia is in China. 51% of our candidates are women. And something like 37% of our members are women in China. The point about this is not to sort of bang on about women's issues. It's more to say that if we are to be better investment advisors, then diverse teams make better decisions at the end of the day than teams that are not diverse. So that's the tack we're taking on this. It's not about our views about whether society is structured fairly or not. It's about how do we build investment teams that have healthier outcomes for our clients. And so we're very interested in diversity. Gender diversity is obviously just one aspect of diversity. There are lots of other social factors as well, but gender diversity is the one that we feel that we can do something about through our work in universities. So that's how we're tackling that particular issue. We're spending a lot of time now sort of really thinking through how we can appeal to young women doing the right sorts of degrees in universities, how we can attract them into the profession. And I think it's also part of a branding issue that we have at the moment. Our profession is not particularly attractive, I don't think, as far as young women are concerned, because it doesn't seem to have a purpose other than enrichment of ourselves, and obviously is perceived quite rightly to be a very male-dominated sphere to start with. So we've got a lot of work to do, really, if we're to improve that. So basically, that's my analysis of where we are today. We've had some unethical practices, obviously. We've got a poor value proposition in terms of fees and our focus on quarter-over-quarter performance as opposed to outcomes and solutions. That gives us a loss of trust and then hence regulatory intervention, declining intermediation, and an increasing propensity to hold non-cash generative assets. So that's a quick snapshot of where we are. Nothing much really to say there, as I gave you those numbers. That I love. That's my favorite slide. that talking about diversity. That's and we've got the exam coming up on December the 5th. That's the first ever CFA class. That's the exam. That's the exam in 1963. The purpose of this is I'd fit right in there now, but the purpose of this is really to say that the CFA charter has sort of kind of moved on. In 1963, you had to be 38 to sit the CFA exam. Yeah, and I met in Los Angeles 6 months ago a gentleman who was 27 at the time of this photo and was refused entry to the CFA exam. And I can promise you, 50-odd years later, it still rankles with him. He's obviously a man now who's approaching 80, if he's not already over 80. Still goes to LA Society events, and is still pissed that that he wasn't in this photo. So there you go. Now, the point of this is back in 1963, the CFA really was a sort of almost a PhD, if you like. It was something that senior folk sat to prove their credential. And obviously that changed many, many moons before I did, before I came on the scene. But I really want to talk about that a little bit, because it's sort of part of this thing about being a profession. Today, the way we structure the curriculum is that we go out and we do this thing called practice analysis that some of you may have been involved in. We ask CIOs from all walks of life and from all parts of the world what they would like to know that someone in the first 3 to 4 years of their profession should have. What should that individual who's 3 or 4 years into their careers know? And that's what the curriculum teaches. It's not a PhD. It's not rocket science in that sense. It's not anything other than a qualifier for the industry, really. And that's disappointing to a lot of charter holders, depending on what vintage you came in to the charter in. If you're someone who came in perhaps 25, 30 years ago, I think the character of the charter has changed, or the character of the institute has changed. And what we are today is the exam for people who are entering this profession. And I think that's important, because if we are to build a profession, again going back to my poor tortured doctors, when you go to the doctor, you expect 100% of all doctors to have a medical credential. Today, our penetration of fiduciary managers globally is about 12%. Okay, so only 12% of everybody worldwide holds our credential, and as we all know, there aren't really any competing credentials, really. So our challenge, if we're to build a profession, and it's a long-term aspirational goal as far as I'm concerned, but I want to lay it before you today, is that I want to have 100% of everybody who is a fiduciary for other people's money to have a proper credential. It doesn't have to be ours. I would rather it was ours for obvious reasons, but it has to be a credential of an equivalent standard. That is not the same as saying that I want to depress the level of qualification to get a charter holder at all. Those are two different things. I'm absolutely passionate. I think that the hurdle that we have set for people to get into this profession is the right one. I think we've got that right, and I have no intention of diminishing the quality of the CFA program. Our pass rates, as you know, are about 40% for level 1, 42, 43% for level 2, and a whopping 51% for level 3. So that is kind of where we are today. The standard of the exam is independently set for those people who know it, so we don't set it on pass rates. It's done on the basis where we look at each exam and we compare it to other exams, and we decide objectively what the standard for passing is. And none of that is going to change, and none of that level is going to change. But again, if we are to build a profession, what we have to accept is that most of our employers do not give sufficient time off for their students to study for this exam. My daughter's a lawyer in London. Her firm gave her 6 months off to study for her legal exams on full pay. On full pay. Now, I know that doesn't necessarily happen in the US, but other professions do provide time and support for students to go through their professional training. On average, I would say most companies at the industrial end of town, the BlackRocks, the Fidelities, people like that, maybe give 1 or 2 days off, you know, and that's 3,000 pages of curriculum you've got to nail in a day. That's you know, that's a lot of reading that you have to do. So it's really the support that we give is so minimal to our students. We have this sort of hair-shirted, sort of hairy-chested thing that we go around sort of saying, well, you know, it's a test of someone's character if they can do this while they've, you know, having children, paying the mortgage off, dealing with all the other things, and working full-time, then it shows that that person's got a great deal of character, and so it does. But if we have the intention of trying to build a profession, then as employers, we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we help students through the credential and out the other side. And I see very little attention at this stage to that aspect of training, really. We are paying lip service to it as an industry rather than really getting serious about it. So I think that's one aspect that I'm very vocal about, and we spend a lot of time. Dan O'Connor, who's here. Dan, why don't you just stand up and wave at everybody? Dan, who's my colleague in New York, looks after in this region our interfaces with employers. And that's one of the many conversations we have with employers, is how can we help them change their training methods. So what have we done? We've divided the organization into 3 strategic functions. The first, most easy one to discuss is credentialing. So that's got the 3 programs in it. So that's CFA, CIPM, the forgotten child of the CFA Institute, and Claritas, which is the program for middle and back office staff. So that's what's in credentialing, along with all of the examination side as well. That's just basically to say, well, you know, what's the laundry list of things that make up a profession? I like this one best. I almost got lynched in Australia for this one. One of the things that is important for a professional is that you actually have to renounce profit maximization. And I know in America that's almost like heresy, basically, but it's not as bad as that phrase sounds. It's if you're a professional, the understanding from your, again, you know, if you're a patient of a doctor, the understanding, it may be false, obviously, I know there are a lot of bad doctors around nowadays, but the understanding when you sit down in front of your doctor is that your doctor is going to prescribe what's best for you, not what's best for she or he. And so that's what I mean by the renunciation of profit maximization. It's not that I expect everybody to become a charity overnight. It's that if we're serious about being a profession and putting our clients' interests first, and serious about putting them at the heart of everything that we do, then you have to follow the logic of that through to say that profit is a secondary consideration to actually serving your client. And that's really what that's meant to say. The second and most important function is member value, i.e. what do we do for all of you people in this room? And that's something that I think we've been woefully poor at over the years. So we're starting these 3 initiatives really to try to start to add some more value to members. The first is from the 1st of September, we increased the funding to all of our societies, our operational funding, by 50%. And we will double that over the next 3 to 4 years. So, and I'll come back to the maths on that, but really the cynicism from my side, or the cynic in me, says that what I've done is when I attend a dinner like this in 3 or 4 years' time and a member sticks up his hand and says, well, what do you do for me, Mr. Smith? You're a complete waste of money. I say, well, that may be true, but most of your dues, actually, I pay straight to Ursula, and blame her, basically. So that's the sort of cynical. 50% of your $275 in 3 years' time will come straight back to Ursula, along obviously with the society dues that you pay. So that's the first piece of the plan. The second is doubling the spend on brand. So we've gone from, roughly speaking, it's actually more than doubled. We actually spent about $5 million on brand, and we've increased that to $15 million this year. New branding campaign starts in January, but it's more than that, actually. It's the first time ever we have completely abandoned marketing to students. So this campaign is not about getting new charter holders. This campaign is geared towards the employers of charter holders, both as high net worth individuals who might wish to employ a charter holder to run their money, or obviously institutional employers. So this is all about trying to talk about how anyone who has money to be managed needs to have a professional, an expert in charge of that money. It's also there to try to start to differentiate ourselves from the general alphabet soup that's out there, CFPs, CPAs, etc. So how do we carve out our own territory? It's not meant to be in opposition to CFPs or to CPAs. They have their function in life. But what we need to do is to better explain what a CFA does. And we also need to explain that in opposition to investment banking as well, where at the other end of the spectrum we get mixed up with the general mess on Wall Street. So the branding campaign is really about trying to pull the CFA out, distinguish it as a separate profession, obviously, and then to talk to anybody who has an investment management issue to say, well, you should go and hire a CFA. And the campaign, which has been done in conjunction with all of our societies, we pulled a society brand council together because I never want to hear from any member that the message wasn't properly consulted, and the media that we're putting this brand campaign out wasn't also consulted. Both of those things we've spent 5 months with a society brand council going through, and we've tried to get a message that everybody can subscribe to around that theme of professionalism. And the campaign starts in January of this year. The other piece that we've put into that campaign, a very small piece, you'll get about, each society will get about $6,000 and all of the collateral to use locally. So you'll get things like drive time radio adverts, billboard collateral, all of those things that you can do within your community here in South Florida. So that's the idea, and that's a very small amount of money to start with. But what we're saying is, if any society has some bigger ideas about what they'd like to do with that collateral, then you can always apply for project funding, and we'll increase it. And you can always use your reserves as well. One of the challenges that we have as a CFA society is that CFA societies collectively sit on about $40 million of reserves. That's doing nobody any good. And what I'm trying to say is that I would like you to liberate some of those excess reserves and spend them. Now, you don't have to spend it on the brand campaign, but try and encourage you to spend it. And what I'm saying in return for that is that the Institute actually has $300 million of reserves. $300 million, okay? So what am I doing with that $300 million? Well, the first thing that I can do is to underwrite your first loss on something. So if you come up with a plan, a big plan to do a conference or something like that, that you think you've got some financial downside on, I'll take that risk off your books and say, right, you've got to try and make this thing profitable. But if it doesn't be profitable, if an event doesn't be profitable or something that you're trying to accomplish, I'll underwrite that risk for you. So trying to get societies to think a little bit bigger, to be a little bit more creative, to impact the communities that they work in. The third thing is technology. We're rolling out essentially a Salesforce lookalike to all societies so that we can finally share information between the Institute and the societies and hopefully be much more effective in the way that we work with companies. The third area is standards and advocacy. In there is the future of finance. That's our thought leadership engine. In there is also the research foundation, which is obviously also in thought leadership, codes and standards, and also the advocacy work we do with regulators. So the way to think about this is how we make new professionals, and obviously we've made a few tonight. 20 young people have joined the profession. The next thing, though, is to service the hell out of them and to make them the best investment professionals that they can be throughout their careers, so that through their societies, which hopefully all 20 new charter holders will have joined, and all 20 will now volunteer their services to support that society, through the societies, we can develop real value for members. And what I want to try and do is to get every single CFA charter holder into a society. At the moment, we have about a 7 or 8% gap between institute membership and society membership, and I think that's just embarrassing, frankly. Every institute member should be a member of a society, and if we're to be a true profession, should want to contribute to society through their society. And for me, much more effective to talk to the 147 societies we have than to talk to 130,000 individual members. So I'm really trying to figure out how we can elide that difference between members and societies. And then once we're servicing that member, we also want to make sure that the industry background that the member is operating in is as healthy and as positive as it can be. And that's the standards and advocacy piece. So it flows that way. Make a well-credentialed professional, service them as best they can through their career, and build an industry that really supports them as well. So that's kind of the way we've sort of divided our activity. I love this slide. Just so you know, 86% of our revenue comes from the program, 14% from member dues. So we are about a $250 million business. About $34 million comes from the $275 US you pay me. The other 86% comes from the program. Very important what I said earlier on, that we are a member organization. There is still people alive in my world, my colleagues, who believe that this 86% has nothing at all to do with the members. Okay, that's not your money, according to a number of people who work for the CFA Institute. And that we are really trying to change. So what we've done in the funding that we've increased is, for the first time, we have linked your funding to the number of candidates, not just the number of members you have, but also the number of candidates you have in your zip codes, basically. So what we're trying to do is to say that we should all be aligned. This is your money. It's not anybody else's money. We have a program because we're a member organization. We don't have, as I said earlier, we don't have members who are stuck on the end of a program. So that's what we do. This is how we spend the money. 55%, 54% on the programs, 36% on that member value, and 10% on standards and advocacy. So for the smart ones in the room, 46% is spent on our members. 46% of $250 million is about, I don't know, 120 odd million US. And I collect in $34 million. So I spend, roughly speaking, 3 times on each and every one of you than I collect in. There isn't a single charter holder in the room who has believed what I've just said, basically. and I know that, and it doesn't upset me in that sense. We have a huge gap between what we do at the Institute and what you as members feel. And that's what my job over the next 4 or 5 years is how can we stop wasting so much money and spend that $120 million US in a way that every member in this room will really feel. So the branding, which we will over double over the next 3 to 5 years, plus the operational funding added together will equal over $275 US. So that's the first thing I'll be able to say, is that everything else that I do, all the publications, the professional conduct program, everything else that goes on at the Institute is actually free to you. After your $275 US, that's all free. But that's not good enough, obviously. I also have to make that additional $600 really felt by you in terms of services that you really value. And so what we're going to try and do is to really make those services much more helpful to you in your practical day-to-day lives. And the challenge there is to say that the Institute really is very well-meaning, but the people who are in the Institute are by definition not investment practitioners. They are, like me, in many cases, many years out of the profession. So how do we deliver services? How do we deliver content that you want? Well, we have to leverage our members much more. We have 130,000 members worldwide. They need to be helping each other through communities of practice and other methods to share best practice in the industry going forward. So that's something that you'll see going forward is a much greater focus on trying to tap the talent we have within our membership to help produce practical information for all of our members worldwide. And that's kind of it, really. I'll stop there. I mean, that's what we do. Really, just to sort of summarize all of that, this is really so this is my agenda, if you like. To try and produce well-qualified professionals, to encourage people to be the best professionals that they can be, and to engage, obviously, with their society, to try and encourage businesses to change their business models, to think a little bit more about solution provision, putting their investors first, a little bit less about charging inappropriate fees through untransparent products. And then obviously to engage with regulators and society in general to talk about how we add value to the wider society that we operate in. So that's sort of trying to put on one page what I think the recipe for success is. And the whole idea is that if we can continue to grow our membership, if we can continue to be recognized as the leaders in the investment profession, if we continue to build the brand of the CFA, then hopefully in the future we'll achieve that position of dominance that we would all like to. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Take any questions on anything? Yes.
Are we going to have mandate CPE in the near future?
Are we going to have mandatory CPE in the near future? Great question. I don't know is the answer to that, but I do know what I'm doing about it, which is that we have kicked off a project that you will be feeling here in the US primarily to reopen that subject and to consult with societies about what they feel. There's no question that if we had a vote on mandatory CPE, Europe and Asia would overwhelmingly vote for it. The US, I'm not so sure. So what we would like to do is to focus that listening tour on the US and understand, and probably we'll just focus on the larger societies, really what the current thinking of the membership is on mandatory CPE. So we're going to do that over the next year and come up with an answer. Even if I thought that I could win the vote, I have no intention of putting it to the vote unless I can really be sure of a sort of 70% positive vote. I think anything less than that would be a Pyrrhic victory, would be a victory that would sort of tear us apart, and I'm not really that interested in doing that, for the simple reason that I think on mandatory CPD, the tide is coming in, and it's just a question of time. Whether it's this year, next year, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, I don't know. But I don't want to get ahead of the membership as far as that's concerned. I think we have to be very careful, very thoughtful, make sure that the membership is as I say, overwhelmingly in support of it, and then put it into place. And there are many questions within all of that as to how we would do it, what would qualify for CPD, how much you would need, who's going to make money out of it. All of those things are very important. The one thing I can tell you is we won't do it like we did it in the past, that we will make this a society-led issue rather than an institute-led issue, and we will ask our society leaders to carry the baton forward into their communities on this. And if there is a business model behind mandatory CPD, it will be for the societies to make that money and not for the institute to make that money. And those were reasons, I think, the reason why I'm saying that is that those were some of the reasons why it got shot down last time. The institute really made a complete mess of the way that it was presented to the membership last time. So that's really my thinking as far as that's concerned. So in 2 years' time, I would either expect to go forward or to say the time is not right. Okay?
Right now, I think there's some online content, webcasts, et cetera, available through the Institute. I think the current standard is voluntary 20 hours overall and 2 hours recommended.
68% of all members attest that they do that.
Right. Do you think it would be possible that people could do it exclusively through online so they could remove cost or traveling to things as a factor and say, I'm a professional, I'll be happy to read it or watch the webcast and do it in that form as opposed to say I've got to pay someone to go, like some some designations you have to.
Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, I don't know whether anyone has gone on and taken the new ethics course that we've just developed, which is an online ethics course, which takes about an hour and a half to do. I can't remember what it's called there, and it's slipped my mind. Ethical decision making. Thank you. There's that. That's an online course at the moment that we've just developed, and that could form part of that. And then there's lots of other things as well. So yes, that's very definitely in the thinking. It's not so much, and I agree with what you said. I was reading actually last week. My colleagues pulled out all of the comments from 2002 when it was last put to the membership, and it was comments like that were interesting. That most people are not against continuing professional education. It's how it's offered. It's how it's done. That's the key, and we got to find the right mix.
And I was looking online. There were some great things I want to watch or read. I'm not sure. Maybe it was there, but I'm not sure it's clear. Like which ones are SER qualified. Versus,
right.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, the whole thing needs to be sorted out in terms of how we offer it. But yes, I agree. Yes, sir.
I'm looking at the slide, and one of the things you didn't spend a lot of time on is changing the business model.
Yeah.
I was wondering what kind of your early thoughts are on that. And my experience, most of the business leaders are not CFA charter holders.
No.
And
Not here in the States. That's absolutely true. When I go to Canada, every CEO and every CIO is a charter holder. That isn't an exaggeration. They're all charter holders. We have the highest penetration rate in Canada, and they're under regulatory pressure as well as their own sort of pressures to change models towards advisory fees, effectively, and away from embedded fees within products. So Canada is changing quite fast. What we're also going to do, very similar to the University Recognition Awards, we're going to have Industry Recognition Awards. So we're going to try and annually call out those companies who have done the right things. And BlackRock would be one of them, but they may not get the top award, as it were. They may get the silver as opposed to the gold award. And so we're looking for all of these things. We're looking for some of the things I talked about earlier. What do you do for training For instance, what's your gender diversity within your business? So we're going to have a number of identifiers and then really try and ask societies as well to identify companies, because they don't have to be the global majors. It can be on a local level as well within communities, because we have many, many fine businesses around the United States particularly, that we should call out and we should say, well, you know, but they aren't necessarily the marquee names that people have heard of. They're generally in private ownership as opposed to in public ownership. So I think that's this challenge between, are we an industry or are we a profession? That's the fault line, really. And I'm certainly not going to resolve it in my lifetime. But you know, when you go back into history, I think you know, the public ownership of asset management businesses has made life a lot harder for this work of trying to sort of establish a profession, basically.
Yes.
It's interesting, your concept on not being a profession versus industry. If you look at other professional associations, their budgets are predominantly geared towards lobbying.
Yeah.
A significant amount of their dollars are lobbying regulators of their profession.
Yeah.
If you're trying to move the association more towards a profession, your budget's going to have to change significantly to look at that lobbying of regulators.
Yeah.
Possibly, but what we consider ourselves to be a professional body as opposed to a trade body. So we're not interested in lobbying for the practitioners. We're interested in lobbying for free and fair markets that help both practitioners and investors. So I'm not in the pay of BlackRock or Fidelity or anybody else. So I'm not lobbying for the industry as such. I'm lobbying for the profession that serves investors and the industry. So I don't disagree. We do, in our stand as an advocacy business, I think we do a fairly imperfect job in terms of lobbying in DC, which is, as you correctly point out, an extremely expensive affair. We do some of it, but we're not, I don't think, particularly successful at it. Bizarrely, we are much more successful as a political lobbyist in the developing world, where we are usually the only voice at the table, as opposed to in Washington or Brussels, where we're just one of hundreds, and we don't have the budget to really, as you point out, to sort of be successful at that. So, you know, I agree with you. I think that's a challenge for us. But as I say, what we're very determined not to do is to become a trade association, really.
Yes.
On the topic of member value, you know, a lot of us are academically inclined. You know, it's a competitive world, so you get your CFA and you have graduate degrees, you think, what else can I do to improve myself? And in today's world, the education market's changing. There's all these certifications you can get at universities. I think it's just a shame with all the resources the CFA has that you don't have, you know, a certificate of forensic accounting, for example. Different ways to, aside from the continuing education, you know, frankly, I do some of the courses, but the technology doesn't even record it for me. It doesn't work. So I don't worry about getting that, because I'm not so sure that that would actually help me that much, so that I have on my resume that I did my continuing education as opposed to get a certificate at a local university. So I just, have you done any thinking along those lines?
Well, we constantly do thinking about what other programs we could develop. I guess that comes back to the first points that I made. I really want to focus in on doing better what we currently do. And I think there's an awful lot of work that we need to do that first before we start developing other certificates. So I'm going to need a huge amount of convincing that we should go down that educational role. And it's why I also started by saying that we're a member organization, first and last, and not an educational organization. So now, obviously, the members, as you are, can demand other programs from us, and we should try and fill that member demand. But that's the way round I want it to be, rather than for us to think of ourselves as an educational organization that's competing against a Coursera or a Harvard Business School or something like that, and constantly trying to develop new programs because that's our business model, effectively. No, it isn't. No, and frankly, I would be, you know, if you were internal and you saw the struggle that we're having trying to get Claritas up and running and firing on all cylinders, you would be nervous about us starting some other stuff. I mean, we're not, we're not Apple in terms of, why is everyone laughing when I say that? So we struggle a bit with that. So I think really I'd rather, my analysis is that maybe that's the next person. That's the next person who has my slot can take us in some more aggressive directions. I think my job over the next, I've told everyone that I'm only going to be in this role for 5 years. I've done 11 months, not that I'm counting the days, but I've done 11 months. So I have 4 years and 1 month to go. And I think my job is really to do our core job really well, and then to hand on to the next person and see what they can make of the Institute from then on in. But hopefully deliver them a sound platform from which they may well be able to do lots of other things. Accounting, it's interesting that you talk about forensic accounting, because it's one of the few areas in our advocacy division, going back to your point, that we actually have some expertise in Sandy Peters' area in New York. We have about half a dozen people who are focused on the accounting profession, and we actually are, we have reasonable representation at the IASB and one or two other sort of global bodies. So we're in that world, but we don't, one of the problems with advocacy is it's such a slow burn, it takes such a long time, it's very hard to convince members that that's money worth spending and that we're actually making progress, because it's sort of, it's like watching paint dry in terms of actually accomplishing something. So it's advocacy, I think, is something that we need to think through a lot more carefully, because it is difficult. When I'm here in the US, mostly what concerns members are retirement schemes, really, and the mess that the retirement scheme industry is in, and the fiduciary standard, really. I mean, those are the two big things that I think we need to be more vocal on. But we are in a lot of sort of much more detailed work in accounting standards and other things, which I think the members don't value as much, because it's not headline grabbing. You can't get into the Wall Street talking about FASB whatever, and it's of no interest to anyone. So it's a challenging area for us.
Yes, sir.
So as far as value of the CFA designation, where do you see, and maybe going forward, if we're going to have some opportunities to, say, maybe get credit for having the CFA in other programs or others, maybe like universities or educational programs, where having the CFA gives you something of value to go into some other programs, things of that nature?
Yeah, I haven't been thinking about it that way. What we have started to think about is how we can combine with other professional organizations. I don't mean that in a legal sense, but how we can work with AICPA, for instance, and other professional bodies, maybe the CFP as well, to cross-pollinate a little bit more than we are currently doing. We've had this culture, I think, within the CFA of being quite arrogant, of sort of saying that, if it wasn't built here, it's really not worth anything. And so we're trying to unlock that a little bit and say, well, how do we leverage ourselves? Well, we have to do that in conjunction with other professional bodies. So we're really at ground zero as far as that thinking is concerned, but we're very conscious that we should be partnering up with other professional bodies to try to extend our reach. Quite what that means, I'm not really very clear on at the moment, to be honest, in terms of...
Like FINRA, some of the requirements through FINRA, and what size of it.
Well, we do a lot of work on that. We have something, again, one of the things that people don't recognize is that we have a team which is called regulator recognition. And we're now in 18 countries, including the US, we have some degree of exemption from local licensing exams. I think the one where we have total exemption from is bizarrely Peru or something like a country like that. So we have about 18 of those, and we're working constantly on those around the globe to try and get charter holders exemptions from local licensing exams. It's a very, in that particular aspect is very interesting, because there's a number of people who don't want us to do that, because the logic in their mind goes that if we get too close to regulators and we get those exemptions, then regulators will try and control the content of our program. So there is a school of thought within the CFA that says we shouldn't have anything at all to do with regulators. And that's not coming from the CFA Institute, that's the membership will push back and say don't do that stuff with regulators. It's not what we want. Are you trying to become an SRO, which I'm not, going down those sorts of roads. We're sort of, at the moment, we're sort of a halfway house, if you like. We're trying to get as many exemptions as we can and kind of see where we get to, really, is the best that I can say.
Yes.
When you mentioned about spending on a brand, I was just wondering more specific. Have we ever considered doing like a commercial on CNBC or CNN?
Yep. Well, we have, and if you turn on Bloomberg TV in a couple of months' time, you'll see fellow charter holders. We've just shot the TV footage up in New York, in fact, and that's, I think it's Bloomberg TV we're going for. I think so, yeah.
I'm asking this because actually when I first got my charter, when I got the email, so I started talking to my client about this, and honestly, more of them have heard about Betterment or interactive brokers than CFA charter holder. So I feel like I have to explain to them, and actually it's kind of like I have to sell this to them. And in combined with the point you just made, we as a professional, as very high standard professional, we want to provide service instead of selling service to them. But without them acknowledging the denomination, we have to sell this to them if we want to get the business done. So, I mean, commercials or more specific, I just want to know some more specific plan how to explain.
Well, the only comfort I can give you is that you're not alone. There are another 130,000 charter holders who have exactly that problem, that we have got a dreadfully low recognition out there in the marketplace. And I'm delighted to say I got an Uber cab today, and my Uber driver was studying for the CFA. So I was absolutely thrilled. He almost crashed when I told him who I was. But anyway, that only in America. But yeah, our recognition is woeful. So what we're doing is this campaign is in all the major media, billboard, social media, television, radio, a whole range of things. We're starting it small, deliberately. We're only putting $16 million in. CFP spends $16 million a year in America, so we're spending $16 million worldwide, including China. So it's a drop in the ocean. But what we're going to be doing over the next 5 years as we figure out what works and what doesn't work is doubling that amount. So our plan is to go to somewhere between $35 and $40 million in the next 5 years. And a big chunk of that will go straight to our societies so that they can amplify that message within their local community through, for instance, here in the US, drive time radio is important, and billboard advertising, things like that within the South Florida area would be something that we would provide you with the collateral with and financing for.
Because when I first told my parents I'm going to start the CFA, they told me, don't party too much, just finish your school.
I'm sure your parents would have told you that whatever.
Just to briefly piggyback on his remark, I've seen advertisements for the CFP commercial, which I think is very effective, and Betterment today on CNBC, and I think CNBC is watched by many more clients than Bloomberg TV.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's also much more expensive.
Yes.
But we're not going to
Right.
I think one of the most important thing about the CFA is the people. It's highly respected because it's difficult.
Yeah.
And my personal experience, I'm not talking down about the CPA, but CPA used to be a really, really difficult test, and when the change become computerized, and a lot of people get CPA, and it become less competitive. So like some people were forced to take another more difficult credentials like a CFA. So I just wonder, this is not going to change the standard of the CFA. It's
Definitely not. No, we're absolutely adamant about protecting the standard of the CFA. We would like a lot more people to have it, though. So the point is that those two goals are not mutually exclusive, in my view. We have to work harder to make businesses spend more on training. There is plenty of evidence within the CFA that shows that the more time students have off to study, bizarrely, their pass rate goes up. Who knew? Who knew? There's a revolutionary new concept there. Given as I say, in China, for instance, there are only 1 or 2 businesses that would give students time off to study. The Bank of China does, ICBC does, but the vast majority of asset management businesses in China don't give students time off to study.